would like to welcome today our speaker, Dr. Ron Rosenthal of the Lexington Veterans Association. Dr. Rosenthal is no stranger to our group, as he has spoken here on several occasions before. Ron is an orthopedic surgeon. He served in that capacity in Vietnam and afterwards, after he completed his residency. He's a current resident of Wayland. He moved to Massachusetts from New Jersey in 1999. Ron is a scholar and historian and has association locally to Harvard, Regis, and Brandeis. The American Civil War, which cost over 600,000 American lives, that's more than all the other wars we've ever fought added together when you're talking American lives. Greatest of all American tragedies, therefore. And one of his particular areas of expertise is that Civil War. Today he will speak on Bloody Shiloh, which was one of that conflict's most significant conflicts. Dr. Rosenthal?
Thank you. I've got them wired up.
Got your wires there?
Yep. Don't you break your leg? Oh, I tripped giving a presentation. Yep. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me. Can you all see the slide? Those of you that came earlier saw there was a great deal of bustle getting it working, and we are none of us of the computer age. What we need here is a 7 or 8 year old grandchild who would be able to figure it out in a matter of minutes. Today is April 8th. 2 days and 151 years ago began the Battle of Shiloh, quite a distance from here. Shiloh was the first really major battle of the Civil War between sort of trained armies, and showing for the first time competent generals, competent officers, demonstrating many aspects that would be later understood as part of the Civil War, not the least of which is the generation of large casualties. More men were killed, more men died at the Battle of Shiloh than died in the Continental Army through the entire Revolutionary War. Where to start? Let's go back. February 18th, 1861. A group of men met in Montgomery, Alabama. These were representatives of 7 states that had seceded from the Union: Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Texas. And they formed together what was called the Confederate States of America. And they wrote a constitution which is almost word for word taken from the U.S. Constitution, with notable exceptions, specifically dealing with slavery. Not only was slavery approved by the Confederate Constitution, it was required. For a new state to become a member of the Confederate States of America, it had to allow slavery. No new states joined after May 1861, but that was part of it. Well, the Constitutional Convention, have another next one, decided to pick a leader, and they picked this man, Jefferson Davis, senator from Mississippi. Davis had gotten a reputation as being a moderate as opposed to a fire eater. He had a reputation for ability. He had been in President Pierce's cabinet. He'd been on various commissions. He was, in fact, a well-trained and well-grounded individual to lead a country at war. Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln were born a few years apart, 1 year apart, in rural Kentucky, 30 miles from each other. Davis's family eventually moved to South Carolina and then to Mississippi. Lincoln's family moved to Kentucky, Indiana, and eventually into Illinois. If their families had gone the other way, and in 1861 had Jefferson Davis been senator from Illinois and Abraham Lincoln senator from Mississippi, what would have happened? One of those interesting speculations that turn on things that we have no control over. Davis is elected president. Did he really want to be president, or did he want to be the general-in-chief? Davis is a West Point graduate, among other things. And did he want to be, as in this painting, fanciful painting done several a year or so after he became president. That's him second from left. You know, he's got the epaulettes. And obviously military. On the left, that is Hardee next to Davis. On the left, that's Robert E. Lee. Then Beauregard, Polk, Joseph Johnson, and Crittenden from Kentucky. These were some of the early generals in the Civil War. We don't know. Davis hinted to his wife and others that he would have preferred to be the general-in-chief, but he was made the president instead, a job that he fulfilled under increasing odds and with increasing difficulty, but with no question ever as to his devotion to what we know now as a truly lost cause. Alexander Stephens, senator from Georgia, is elected vice president. Davis and Stephens didn't like each other, and they grew to like each other less and less and less as the war progressed. In fact, Stephens finally walked out and went home to Georgia. Not that he was much help to Davis during the war. Well, next. Davis is inaugurated, and his inaugural speech, which is listened to and read very carefully by everybody, North and South. Davis clearly is saying, we do not want war. All we want is to be left alone. And that would be his theme, on and on and on. And he expects the remaining slave states, Virginia, Tennessee, Missouri, North Carolina, Delaware, and Maryland, to join the Confederacy. After all, they're slave states. Obviously, they should join the Confederacy. But it doesn't work that way. Virginia and Tennessee made it clear that they're not joining the Confederacy unless the Confederacy can show that it is really able to fight and win battles and so forth. Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland are divided. Each of these states is a microcosm of the whole country. They are totally and irrevocably divided, and indeed some of the bitterest battles will be behind the scenes. There'll be civil war in the various border states. Delaware will stay with the Union. That's never a question about Delaware seceding. Next. Well, Davis also expected the European powers to recognize the Confederacy. After all, we're an independent country. Well, it's not quite that simple. And indeed, as we know, no European power ever recognized the Confederacy. And indeed, as we go over that aspect of Civil War history, none of them even came close, not even Great Britain. Despite the rhetoric in the British newspapers, the actual British government never really seriously considered any kind of assistance to the South. In fact, as the war progressed, the United Kingdom would become increasingly hostile to the Confederacy. Lots of reasons for this, but that's another talk. At any rate, the firebrands in South Carolina. South Carolina is the first state to secede, and they are true fire eaters. They want nothing less than we're going to win, we're going to beat all these blank Yankees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right in the middle of Charleston Harbor, the biggest city in the South at the time, is a Union fort. Lincoln, in his inaugural, said he will protect government property. Specifically, he was referring to the forts that were still in Union hands, that hadn't already been abandoned. And the flag is still flying over. Can you go back for a sec? The flag is still flying over Fort Sumter. They're raising the flag in the middle of the courtyard. The Confederates see it. It's a great big flag. Everybody can see it. And so to the fire eaters, this was something that could not possibly be. And so they kind of force Davis' hand, and he orders the capture of Fort Sumter. So on April 14th, 1861, Confederate batteries in Charleston opened fire, and within a day, Fort Sumter is reduced and the small garrison there surrenders. Well, the Union response to this is not what the Southerners expected. Our flag has been fired upon. To arms. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to combat insurrections too powerful to be suppressed by ordinary means, to quote Lincoln. He eventually would get 500,000. The South early on did not recognize or understand the depth of feeling in the North. Conversely, the Northern leaders, including Lincoln, never fully realized until later the depth of feeling in the South. If these had been accurately measured early on, people would have understood very early on this is going to be a long, mean, brutal, horrible, gruesome war, as indeed it turned out to be. both the Confederate and Union forces begin building up armies. There were no significant standing army in the United States, but there were organized state militias, just as there were before the Revolutionary War. And early on, these militia companies, which were mustered into service, whether it be in the North or in the South, were the bulk of the armies at the time. And but there weren't enough of them, and they were poorly trained. They were good at parade grounds and shining their brass and so forth. Those of you that have been in the Army, and I think that's just about everybody in this room, understand the importance of brasso as an Army weapon. And it was no different in the Civil War. Some of the officers went south, if you will, resigned their commissions and joined the Confederacy, but not all. Myth that I was taught in high school in Newark, New Jersey. At the outbreak of the Civil War, the South had the better generals. That's wrong. That's wrong. Subsequent history has shown that that was not true. The South did not have the better generals. They had some prominent ones, but overall, the North, the Union forces were able, in a very short while, to outgeneral the Southern forces, except for some spectacular battles in the East. But that is unfortunately for later. Now, next slide. The strategies are now evolving. And this is a picture of Lincoln and his early cabinet. Standing is General Winfield Scott. He's a man in his 70s. This doesn't show him as he really was. He was overweight. He had congestive heart failure. He could barely walk. He could not mount a horse, but there was nothing wrong with his head. To his right is Lincoln. To his right is Chase. To his right, seated, is Seward. Off on the left, I believe that's Attorney General Bates. Standing is Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy. Francis Blair, Postmaster General. Seated on the left is Simon Cameron, Secretary of War, and I'm not sure who that is. But that's not bad. If anybody recognized that guy. And it's in the book, Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's all there, and be that as may. Scott puts forth the strategy. It's really very simple. Scott early on understood this is going to be a long war. Crush the Confederacy, literally. Strangle the Confederacy, capture the ports, capture the Mississippi, and then by the use of at least 300,000 men, which is an appalling figure in 1861, although it would later be a very small figure compared to the armies that were ultimately raised, literally strangle the Confederacy. Well, not too many people believe that. The prevailing thought was you win a war by occupying the nation's capital, the enemy's capital. The great von Clausewitz, the Prussian theorist who wrote after the Napoleonic Wars, one of the things he wrote was the importance of capturing the enemy's capital. And they're still thinking about that. And they're still thinking in terms of a short war. Because the other side, the Yankees, are not really got their heart in it, and the rebels really don't have their heart in it. So it's going to be one battle will decide the war. The troops will be home by Christmas. Heard that in 1914, 1941, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Heard it going to Iraq, et cetera. July 1861, the first armies clash at Bull Run, a small place about 100 miles away from Washington. This is not really armies. These are armed mobs with inexperienced officers. And eventually the Union forces are pushed back, and they aren't pushed back, they are routed. The Union Army dissolves and runs in a panic back into Washington. The Confederates don't pursue. They can't. They are as disorganized in victory as the Union is in defeat. And this pattern would never again be repeated. Never again in the course of the Civil War would a Union Army break and run from the field in toto. Scattered units would, as they would at Shiloh, but the army itself, when it was defeated, would pull back, would not run in defeat. This is the only time it happened, was at First Bull Run. And still, well, it's a short war. With still one more battle is going to do it. Okay, we have the next map. The initial Confederate states are in gray. The newly seceded states, which seceded after Fort Sumter, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, are shown in mottled. The Confederate strategy is really very simple. The Confederate goal is very simple: independence. The Confederate States of America must be a free and independent state with its place among the family of nations like every other nation, Britain, France, the United States, etc. Nothing short of that would do, and indeed that remained the war aim of the Confederacy until the very, very end, when there was no Confederacy anymore. That never changed. But it must build an army. It must defend its territory because they understood the North was either going to give up or invade them, one of those two options. And their other goal was to capture the remainder of the slave states. Can you go back? Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. And they're in white, the border states. Well, Davis believed they're part of the Confederacy, and it's only a matter of time before they come. Lincoln understood that if you treat these states very, very carefully, they might not secede. So Lincoln ends up winning that battle, and Davis ends up losing. So the Confederates are looking at a strategy of defense. This will require arms and money, which they are sure they could get from abroad. After all, England is dependent upon the Confederate South for cotton. 1860, the United States is the largest producer of cotton in the world. Most of the southern cotton, virtually all of it is exported, the vast majority of it being exported just north. There are no cotton mills in the South. There are more cotton mills in Lowell, Massachusetts than in the entire South in 1860. But after the North, the northern factories, the major customer for southern cotton was Great Britain. Well, it turned out 1860 was a bumper crop for cotton. The British had in their factories, sitting on their wharves, a year's supply of cotton when the Civil War started in the spring of 1861. They had a whole year. They didn't need cotton right away. But it turns out what they really did need, and not too many people understood it, was the United States not only was exporting cotton, but it was exporting food, it was exporting grain, as it does to this day. The reaper had allowed incredible increase in productivity of northern fields so that northern boys could leave the farms and go to join the army. The farms would still be productive, and still huge quantities of grain could be produced. And they sold that to Great Britain. And while the British might be upset about the loss of cotton, they could not tolerate the loss of wheat. That's what they ate and that's what they lived on. This was not well understood in 1861. One of the many reasons why the British never seriously considered recognizing the Confederacy. But Davis and his advisors did not realize that. They did not realize that Britain would not risk a war with the United States, and that Britain and the United States were friendly nations, which they were. Moreover, the British were developing cotton industries in India and Egypt. So, now, the Union's plan is simple. Strangle the Confederacy down the Mississippi, blockade the Gulf, and invade the Southern Territory. Simple plan, hardly easy to execute, but certainly simple to do. And Scott is ridiculed for this. But Bull Run has come and gone, and this period of time between Bull Run, after Bull Run, is a time of building up the armies. The Union forces find a man named George McClellan, who is, it turns out, not much of a field general, but a superb organizer. McClellan is responsible for the organization of the early Union armies, particularly in the East. The Confederacy, the southern states depended upon imports for a lot of what they got. They were not growing, they were growing cotton and they were growing tobacco, but they were not growing food. Well, they began to understand this very early on and started growing yams and corn and so forth. So they could have been able to feed themselves quite easily, but they never had the transportation. And so many parts of the South went hungry during the war. Scott thought that his plan would take 3 years and 300,000 men, and nobody believed him. And of course, he was right. Another slide. Next. Okay. The war divides itself into the East and the West. And the West is anything west of the Alleghenies. So that Ohio is the West. Kentucky is the West. Tennessee is the West. Mississippi is the West. Anything west of that ridge of mountains going, you can see it through right here. The East and the West. Geographically, the war would be divided into two fronts, the East and the West. And it would hinge about rivers. Biggest river in the country is the Mississippi. Both the Union, the U.S., and the Confederacy stride the Mississippi. So it's open to anybody, or closed to everybody if you want to look at it that way. Other critical rivers, however, the Ohio, the Missouri to a lesser extent, and the Ohio's tributaries. The Tennessee, which rises here in the mountains, comes down, loops through Alabama, little corner of Mississippi, up through Tennessee, empties into the Ohio at Paducah, Kentucky. Next to it, doesn't show on this map, is a smaller river, the Cumberland, that similarly goes like that, and ends up in the Ohio, a little bit east of where the of Paducah, where the Tennessee ends it. In the east, the rivers in Virginia, the Potomac, the Rapidan, the Rappahannock. What do they all have? All the rivers in the east run east-west. So they are barriers to invasion. This is 1861. The National Railroad network had not been built yet, although it was rapidly a building. Major transportation was by river, whether it be freight, passengers, what have you. It all came by river. The rivers were absolutely critical. In the south, however, or in the west, the rivers run north-south, the Mississippi, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee. They are not barriers to invasion, they are avenues for invasion. And people understood this quite early on, that the rivers in the east could be used defensively, but the rivers in the south had to be defended. And the Ohio River becomes critical. The Ohio River is the northern border of Kentucky. Kentucky is not seceded. If Kentucky were to secede, the northern border of the Confederacy would be the Ohio River, an almost impenetrable barrier. Would have put the Confederacy in a far more secure position than it was. So it's critical to the Union that Kentucky remain in the Union. And indeed, it does. The major armies at first are deployed in the east. They are going to go for each other's capital. Washington, and it's not on the map, 100 miles south is Richmond. The two capitals are 100 miles apart. When Virginia seceded, the capital is moved from Montgomery to Richmond, and indeed this was part of the deal by which Virginia agreed to secede from the Union. 100 miles, and again, Clausewitz said, capture the enemy's capital. So the early battles, the early fights in the east, which led pretty much to a draw, were all aimed at capturing the other guy's capital. Most of them were the Union forces attempting to capture Richmond, which, by the way, they would not do until April 1865. In the West, on the other hand, there's this huge, vast territory, which is where the food is grown, where the people come from. It's critical. Davis understands the importance of this, and he appoints an overall commander in the West. A man named Albert Sidney Johnston, an old friend of his from West Point, former quartermaster, in and out, could not make a living in civilian life as a colonel in the regular army, posted to the new state of California when the Civil War breaks out. Johnston is from Texas. Texas secedes. He, in a dramatic ride east by horseback with a couple of trusted aides, eludes Union forces, makes his way to Richmond, where Davis recognizes him. They greet each other probably, I don't know, warmly. And Davis makes him a general in command of the entire West. Now that's a large amount of territory. Davis, however, has a faith in Albert Sidney Johnston as the finest general on the continent, the finest general in the Army. How lucky we are to have him. I knew I had a general in Sidney Johnston, he said many, many times. Sidney Johnston understands the possibility of defending the entire Western Territory. So at first he uses the small armies at his command. He moved them here, he moved them there, moved them here. Basically a giant game of bluff to make the Northerners think that he has a much larger army than he does. Unfortunately, this not only fools the Northerners, it fools a lot of Southerners too, who thought there's this huge army in Tennessee in the South protecting us. He is trying to get trained armies in different parts of the South and the North are being trained little by little. Confederate boys, Southern boys are still joining up. leaving the farms, by the way, without farmhands. Northern boys are joining up, leaving the farms to the reapers, which were very good at it, far better than the northern farm boys were. Johnson has to deal with some contentious officers too, some people who went south, who would keep coming up over and over again, who we'll meet again: Bragg, Breckinridge, Polk, Hardee, Beauregard, and Buckner. They're all competent. Not all were competent. They're all West Point graduates, and Jefferson Davis made all the major appointments himself, and everybody was a West Point graduate. This was unfortunate because some very competent generals, two in particular, Nathan Bedford Forrest and Patrick Cleburne, who were not West Point graduates, never got promoted to the commands that their talents would have allowed them to do. Well, Johnson wants to occupy Kentucky and do it politely so the Kentuckians don't rebel and throw their lot with the Union. He loses Kentucky due to some ineptitude on the part of his general, most prominently General Polk. Kentucky is lost to the Confederacy. Kentucky does not and will not ever secede. Johnson understands what this means. It means that the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers, avenues into the South, their mouths are entirely within Union hands. The Union forces are building up rapidly a gunboat fleet on the Mississippi. Much of it due to the work of a man named James Eads, who was a salvage operator of boats, and Eads would later go on to famous building the first steel arch bridge across the Mississippi River in about 1869. The Eads Bridge is still in business, by the way. You can drive across it if you wish. But Johnson realizes this bluff of his is not going to last forever. Sooner or later, the Union's going to discover it. So he starts bringing in troops from elsewhere. Early Confederate strategy said we must leave garrisons at all the seaports to guard them. Well, this thinned out the small Confederate army, and Johnson is able to convince him that this is not the way to go. He begins concentrating the army, and he brings all these generals and their commands. Beauregard from Virginia. Beauregard considered himself the victor of Fort. He's the hero of Fort Sumter, and he considered himself the victor of Bull Run. But he's a competent guy. Bragg from Florida, contentious, but in the last analysis, highly competent officer. Polk from Kentucky, mistake, should never have made a general. And they are all meeting in Corinth. See on the map. Corinth is in the corner of Mississippi. It's the Mississippi-Alabama corner, and it's a major railhead. There are very few railroads in the South, and most of them run north-south, just like the rivers. One major east-west railroad runs through Corinth. So it's a major, major strategic point for the little railroads the South has. And that's where they're meeting, and that's where they're joining up, and that's where they are coming together. Eventually, the Union forces will realize that what their job is, and it's to open the rivers. The mouth of the Tennessee River on the left, emptying into the Ohio, is in Ohio. In Kentucky, no good. The mouth of the Cumberland is likewise in Kentucky. So Johnson wants to build forts in as north part of Tennessee as he can to guard these rivers. Well, that's an impossible task. Fort Henry is the larger one built on the Tennessee in a poor spot, not completed. Likewise, Fort Donelson in a much better spot, but the Tennessee is a more important river than the Cumberland. And Grant is well aware of this, that the Confederates are building plots. Beauregard, Bragg, Polk. Polk was a bishop of Louisiana. He had cast aside his military career after graduating from West Point and become a holy man, but Davis brought him back, and Hardee, of these four, probably the best of all the generals. Hardee had written a manual on arms for the Army. These guys have all gone south. They're all with the Confederate Army, and they are all of varying talents. But Grant, next slide, we'll see him over and over and over again. This is one of the first pictures of Grant as a very young, newly minted brigadier general, very early on in the war. Grant understands that Fort Henry is vulnerable because it's flooded. Not well sited. And it's February 1862, and the rivers are rising, and Fort Henry is flooded, so he sends his gunboats in, and Fort Henry surrenders, but most of the troops get away. And they get to Fort Donelson, just a couple of miles down the road, and he is waiting for them, and eventually he invests Fort Donelson, and the generals inside Fort Donelson decide to give up, which they do. So now the mouth of the Tennessee and the mouth of the Cumberland are in Union hands. And it's not going to take long for the Union gunboats to get from where they're being built outside of St. Louis up the Mississippi, or down the Mississippi, down the Ohio, down the Tennessee, and the Cumberland. And on the Cumberland River is the capital of Tennessee, Nashville. Johnson realizes, February 1862, he is severely criticized, of course, because this huge army that he had, how come he couldn't support these two forts? Well, he couldn't because he didn't have a huge army. And the Union forces are growing and continuing to grow. And Grant is getting some competent help. Next slide. And the first we see of this fellow, this is a young William T. Sherman, who would be with Grant essentially for most of Grant's early career, and another General McClernand, who was likewise a competent officer. He is a political general with no military experience, but he turned out to be a highly competent officer. And by April, both armies have about 2,000 men. Johnson is able to get armies together from all over the South. Grant is likewise the same, only Grant has 50,000 more coming under a General Buell and another 5,000 under a General Lew Wallace. Next. Without maps, it makes it very difficult to show. Corinth is where they were, and they are now heading north. Grant is coming south. Albert Sidney Johnston realizes his bluff is over. He must win a great battle. Otherwise, the North is just going to keep pushing him out of Tennessee. So he is able to reinforce all his forces as much as he can, and he's heading north, aiming for the Tennessee River. Buell is come down to Columbia from Nashville, which is up in the upper right-hand corner, and Grant is encamped at Pittsburgh Landing. However, Grant is under orders not to bring on an engagement. The government in Washington is extremely skittish. Throughout the entire Civil War, the Union forces were plagued by very bad intelligence. And it surfaces over and over and over again in both the East and in the West. Much of it due to the incompetence of a man named Allan Pinkerton, who comes down in history as having built a great detective agency. But as an intelligence gathering officer, he and his people were woefully incompetent. But that's another story. And the Confederates are grouping at, understand that the Union forces are at Pittsburgh Landing. On the Tennessee River, their backs are to the river. They're not entrenched. Nobody expects a battle in the near future. The Union forces believe Johnson is 40 miles away. He's not. He's about 2 miles away. The Union forces are not entrenched. Grant has even gone to his quarters on a steamboat on the river. He is not even on the battlefield. April 6th, 1862, the Confederates come storming out of the woods. Next slide. Before the battle, this is a drawing. Hardee, Bragg, Sidney Johnson, Breckinridge, Polk, Beauregard. These are the Confederate forces. Now, there is no picture, no photograph of Albert Sidney Johnson in a Confederate uniform. The pictures that are shown of him are him in his U.S. Army uniform, i.e. when he was younger, with General's Confederate uniform painted on over it. So this is a drawing, it's not a painting. And Johnson is supposedly telling them, one, I would fight them if they were 1 million, after Beauregard urged him to retreat, that the Union forces must know he's there, and then saying, gentlemen, we will water our horses tonight in the Tennessee River, which was their goal. The morning of April 6th, they come storming out of the woods. The Union forces on the end of the line are getting up, they're starting their breakfast, and here come the rebels out of the woods, and the Union forces are not all open there to meet them. Some of them, most of them were not. Their camps are overrun, and they fall back. Many of them in panic, but not all of them. And they keep charging. Next slide. The Union forces stop. Grant comes hurrying down from the steamboat, sending messengers to Buell and to Wallace, who he knows are nearby. Basically, guys, get your rear ends in here fast, right now. So here he is. And this is kind of the way the battle is going to play out. Grant is forming a defensive line, and the Confederates, Johnson, is pushing it. And what they will do throughout the battle, it will be a push across the whole line. There's no attempt to outflank either of them, which, according to some historians, anyway, could have been done. But that was not what Johnson was planning. The Union forces are pushed back toward the Tennessee River. Some flee to the river. Johnson realizes if he pushes the forces back to the Tennessee River, they can get away. Who has control of the Tennessee River? The Union has absolute control over it, and there are gunboats, one called the USS Lexington, by the way, and steamers and troop ships, and the Union forces could get away if they're by the river. So you realize he's got to push them not this way, but this way. Got to keep them away from the river, so that A, can't be supplied from the river, and B, they can't get away across the river. And that's his general plan, his general idea. But the Union has already shown something. They're very good at artillery. They had learned something from Napoleon, who called artillery the mother of all battles. The Union artillery is very good, and there's lots of them, and they are busy shelling the Confederates, and the Confederates cannot reply. They do not have the kind of artillery, and never will have for the rest of the war, the kind of artillery that the Union forces have. But they are being pushed back, and a group of them under this fellow, this is Benjamin Prentiss, are basically pushed back to a sunken road where they could take some cover, and they stay there. They are ordered by Grant that they are to hold out to the last extremity. That means you stay here until you're all dead, as we know in military parlance. Well, they do that, and they keep shooting back. Sherman has regained parts of his army, McClernand, William H.L. Wallace, a Union general. They're forming a solid line now, and the Confederates are constantly trying to batter that line. And Johnson is at the front with his troops. The actual direction of the battle is in the hands of Beauregard, who's behind the lines, and poor communications. It's the first big battle of the war. Neither army has set up an effective communication system, an effective supply system, or, as it turns out, an effective medical evacuation system. It's too early. There's a lot to be learned. Prentiss will stay there. He will stay there for 4 hours, holding up the Confederate advance until he's down to about 1,000 men, having started with about 8,000, and then he will surrender about dusk. Well, the battle is slowing down now. Next. And here we are now. They have pushed the Union forces back some. Here's the sunken road. That's where Prentiss is holding out. And the area in front of it, they call that the Hornet's Nest because there was constant shooting. Here's a peach orchard. Sidney Johnson is up at the front with his men, rallying his men. And Bragg, who kept ordering the various charges, orders them into what would become the peach orchard right here. And they're reluctant to go, and Sidney Johnson supposedly says, "I will lead you." Mounts his horse, whose name was Fire Eater, puts his sword up in the air, and they go charging, and they do overrun the peach orchard. And Johnson comes back. And he's by himself. And there's one person comes up to meet him, the governor of Tennessee named Harris. Everything that we read about the subsequent problems with ASJ, Albert Sidney Johnson, are Harris's eyewitness reports. Harris goes back, comes back. Johnson is swaying in the saddle. He's basically about to pass out. He falls off his horse. Harris grabs him, lays him out on the ground. Some other men come up. They can't find out what happened because Johnson never indicated that he was hurt, never indicated that he'd been hit until such time as he begins to show the effects of what was then rapid blood loss, where he said to Harris, when Harris said, "General, are you wounded?" And he said, "Yes, and I fear seriously." Well, he falls off his horse. He's unconscious by now, and the only thing anybody can find is one boot is full of blood, and there's a wound in the back of his knee, and before anybody realizes it, he's dead. He's dead. He's bled out. How did that happen? Subsequent stories about the Battle of Shiloh that every author that I have read indicate that Sidney Johnson should not have died from that wound. That's not true. See the next one. And I'm going to digress for a minute. This is an anatomical drawing. This is the back of the knee with the skin pulled away and all the fat. And the knee joint's going to be right in here. Red is an artery in all anatomical books. Blue is a vein, yellow is a nerve. He got shot somewhere in there, and he was shot with what's called a meanie ball, a half-inch in diameter lead projectile that tumbled through the air because it weren't shot from rifled weapons. And when it hit you, it made a big splat. It didn't make a hole. It meant a gash, a laceration, and everything in its way went. So if you look carefully, you'll see the vein is closer to the skin than the artery. In order to cut the artery, which it did, you've got to cut the vein. Actually, veins. Because at this portion of the knee, the artery, this is the popliteal artery it's called, is dividing into 3 major branches that go down into the lower leg. Each of those branches has 2 veins with it. So everything in that area is torn and everything is bleeding. Albert Sidney Johnson is 59 years old at the time of Shiloh. Not old by modern standards, certainly not by our standards, but by the standards of 1862, he's an old man. He does not have the vascular reserve that a 18-year-old farm boy would, who if sustained the same wound, might not bleed out from it. The authors say, Johnson carried a tourniquet in his pocket. Every Union soldier knew how to use a tourniquet. That would have stopped the bleeding and saved his life. That's true. It would have stopped the bleeding. But not a tourniquet that the soldiers carried in their pocket. Excellent. The kind of tourniquet we're talking about is a thigh tourniquet. Can't carry that in the pocket because that's what it looked like. In fact, that was not even considered for use in the field. That was when somebody got to a hospital and needed an amputation. You put that on before you started cutting. So that would have stopped the bleeding, but nothing less than that would have. And much is made of the fact that Johnson had his surgeon with him. Well, it wasn't his surgeon. The man was David Yandell. He was the surgeon-in-chief to the entire Army of Tennessee. Okay, so he had an administrative as well as a professional function. And he had been sent away by Johnson to help treat some wounded prisoners and soldiers that they had found along the way, because Johnson didn't feel he needed them. Well, if only Dr. Yandell had been there. If he'd been there and had a cart with him, and in that cart was one of these, and he realized instantly what had happened, and put the tourniquet on correctly, which is not easy to do, particularly in a field situation, and tightened enough to not stop the bleeding, might have stopped the bleeding before the good general bled out. But he didn't. And he wasn't there. And even if he would there. And he had put the tourniquet on. And he had done all these good things. Then what? All of the stories in subsequent books end there. No, you can't end there. You can't leave a tourniquet like that on a thigh. What are you going to do? How are you going to definitively treat this? 1862, nobody had heard of repairing blood vessels. That didn't come for another 80 years. The only effective treatment for a laceration of a blood vessel or vessels at the time was tying them off above and below. Ligation, it's called. Well, given the techniques of 1862, that would have required an operation, obviously, a major incision, and somebody putting a tie on the artery way up and way down. But there's no artery way down. It's already split into 3 different arteries. So there's no way to even tie it off. The only effective way, the only possible way that he could have been saved is if that artery is tied off above and this ligature would have gotten the artery, the veins, and the nerve, all of them, and then amputate the leg, either at the site of the injury or a little bit above it, which is kind of the way open fractures are managed anyway. Would Sidney Johnson have survived that? 58-year-old man, half bled out? Don't think so. The survival rate of above-knee amputations in the Union forces in the Civil War was later calculated to be something like 60%, which is a little surprising because that's a very high success rate. But most of these are 17, 18-year-old farm boys. They are strong, healthy kids with big vascular reserves. 58-year-old man would never happen. Sidney Johnson sustained a fatal wound at Shiloh. Given the technology of the day, there is no way that he could have been saved. Why don't we take about 15 minutes, 10 minutes right now, and those that need to drain off lunch or something, and then we'll come back and finish this. Well, you got a better way to put it. I'm open to suggestions. Okay, let us resume. Johnson's death at first is concealed. His body's covered with a blanket, but that kind of word never stays concealed for very long, and the word of his death spread rapidly throughout the Confederate forces. What kind of effect it has, nobody was really sure, and isn't sure to this day. Did the death of the commander take the fight out of the Confederates? Nobody knows. We know that by this time, this is around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederates have been shooting constantly since about 7 a.m. They're hungry, they're tired, and many of them are dead or injured. And the battle is beginning to slow down. Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, to be exact, who in this photograph, his hair is dark colored. In one other photograph, he's totally gray. And it was said, oh my God, the stress is so great that Beauregard turned gray overnight. No, that's not it. Beauregard dyed his hair, and the hair dye came from Europe, and the Union blockade ended his supply of hair dye. And from then on, he was gray. It's nothing as, it's fairly common. However, there was a problem with Beauregard that he was regularly sick. He probably had malaria, from which he would periodically recur. It would come back and he'd be out of business for a while. He's a very controversial character, but he is now in command of the battle. Well, he's behind the lines. He's not sure what's going on. Again, there's no good communication. Bragg is still fighting. He's still trying to capture the Hornet's Nest, the Sunken Road, whatever. The Confederate attacks are uncoordinated with each other. One major mass coordinated attack might have broken the Union line. We don't know. The fact is, a Union line was never broken again in the war until the Battle of Chickamauga, when a unit was pulled out of line just as Longstreet's troops came charging through. And that ended the battle. The Confederate soldiers are stopping to loot Union camps. The Union forces were eating their breakfast. So there's bacon, there's coffee, bread, all kinds of stuff, and the Confederates haven't had anything. The Confederate Army suffered from chronic hunger, beginning at the Battle of Shiloh. There was never enough food for the Confederate armies, and indeed, there was never enough food for the Confederate nation. So that as the war progressed, people got hungrier and hungrier. And while all this is going on, the Union forces are being reinforced. Buell in particular, that's Buell in the upper right-hand corner. This is at night. His troops are embarking from a steamer, and it's packed to the gills with soldiers at night. But his people start coming in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And once they start coming, Grant realized, okay, deep breath, I'm going to win it. And Buell would eventually bring close to 50,000 fresh soldiers into the battle who were itching to get in on it. Most of them, probably not all of them. They stormed past the Union soldiers who were cowering by the bank, those who had fled earlier, with some very nasty things to say. Lew Wallace would come in about later on that night, and by the next morning, Grant would have 25,000 fresh soldiers, in addition to the 30,000 or so that he has left from the day before. The Confederates have no more. And that's the story of the Confederate armies from then on. There are no reinforcements. They cannot reinforce, even this early in the war when they theoretically had reserves. But it's night. Beauregard believes that he has won a great victory and calls off any further action, believing that he has Grant up against the river. Grant will not be able to get away, and in the morning, a coordinated Confederate attack will basically sweep the entire Union Army or capture the entire Union Army. And he sends a wire to Jefferson Davis, we've won a great victory. Bedford Forrest, who was then a junior brigadier general, realizes that the Federals are being reinforced. He can see Buell's men coming by the hundreds, by the thousands. And he tries to wake up the Confederate generals, hey, we got to do something or we're going to get wiped out in the morning, and nobody believes him. And Beauregard understood, however, that his army is exhausted. They could not mount another attack even if they want to, or so he felt. So the next morning, early picture of Bedford Forrest. Bedford Forrest was a slave trader before the war, and after the war he was involved with the Ku Klux Klan. So his personal life is somewhat nasty. But as a field officer, he had no peer. He was one of the great generals of the Confederacy for his boldness and his ability to inspire troops and so forth. And he had urged a night attack. What would have happened on that, we don't really know. So it's nighttime, and it's a terrible night, as you might gather. Casualties are everywhere. There's no organized medical evacuation system. They either dragged themselves or dragged to wherever there were some other casualties, and somebody with some kind of medical knowledge was doing something. Most men who died could have been saved later on if they had been able to get to proper medical care, even proper medical care for 1862. The Union Army Medical Service thought up the idea of using tents as hospital, and the Union Army Medical Corps would be in tents until the Vietnam War, as I can tell you from personal experience. Both sides are regrouping their forces. Beauregard's going to make one last push. Grant is going to incorporate these fresh troops into his army, and April 7th, dawn, next slide. Here's where we are. If you noticed, the number of blue lines is a lot bigger than it was on the 6th. This is Buell's troops, and Lew Wallace is coming. He's up there by Buell. He's not across the river when this is made. This is early, and the Confederates are the same. And so Grant attacks first. He learned this at Fort Donelson. When in doubt, attack before the enemy attacks you. And if there's both sides are teetering and not sure, the one that attacks first is going to win. Yeah, winning meant you kill fewer of them than they kill of you. Okay, or maybe they kill more of you, but you take the ground. So Grant does attack, and within a short period of time, next slide, his attack is almost uniformly successful. There's one of the Union forces attacking a farmhouse. The Confederates are going to give way. And by the early afternoon, he has recovered every bit of ground that he lost on the battlefield the day before. So the forces are right back where they were before dawn on April 6th. And Beauregard realizes that it's over. And so he orders a general withdrawal while his army can still get away, which he does. Bedford Forrest does what he does best, covering the rear of the retreating army. The Union forces do not pursue. They can't. They are too knocked about. Grant is criticized for not pursuing. Every time there is a major victory and an army falls back, the victorious army does not pursue because they can't. Gettysburg, Meade is criticized for not pursuing Lee. He couldn't. 3 of his generals were dead or out of action. His army was terribly knocked about. Nobody could pursue. The army in victory is as exhausted and as disorganized as the army is in defeat. So the Confederate forces are allowed to stagger back to where they came from, Corinth. Corinth is a wretched place, malarial, swampy, pestilential, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here come 40, 30,000 soldiers who have been defeated, plus thousands of casualties, and there's no place to put them. Grant finally does organize a pursuit, but Grant is he's promoted by General Halleck, who comes down from Washington to take control of the army and moves very, very slowly. Doesn't make any mistakes, but moves very, very slowly, and eventually gets to Corinth. The Confederates understand there's no way they can hold it, and so they evacuate Corinth. Major railhead connecting a north-south road and one of the very few east-west roads in the South is now in Union hands, and is only April 1862. The war will go on for another 3 years and will end only when the Confederacy is overrun. Again, the Union forces organize tent hospitals. The casualties drag themselves or are dragged. This is a little bit of a fanciful painting because there were no horse-drawn ambulances you see on the left. That came later. That was organized after the Civil War. Although the example was there. Leray and Napoleon's army in 1814 organized a wheeled ambulance corps in the retreat from Russia. It was there. They knew all about it. They weren't able to have it organized yet. And the Union forces ultimately will lose 25% of their army. The Confederates will lose 25% of their army. The Union forces lose more than the Confederate forces. Unusual, because usually the attacking army loses more than the defending army. But in this case, the Union forces lost more. It is the first major battle between armies. There are 40,000 soldiers on each side, total of 80,000, and nothing of that size had ever occurred on the North American continent before. Bull Run, maybe 20,000 total, maybe 4,000 casualties total. Doesn't count. Shiloh was different, and Shiloh set the pattern. Not only were men killed, generals are being killed. The casualty rate among senior officers becomes a factor, increasing severity for the South, particularly as the war progresses. Sidney Johnson is killed, the commander of the Confederate forces. William H.L. Wallace, one of the Union brigadier generals, a man of considerable promise, is also killed. The loss among general officers, who it was felt their duty is to be at the front with their soldiers, would continue on and on into the war. Indeed, by the end of the Civil War, most of the Confederate generals that had started the war were dead. Only a very few had survived the end of the war. Bull Run generated total 24,000 casualties. That's more than the entire American Revolution created for the entire Continental Army. Nothing like that had been ever seen before. Now, of wars to come, this was piddling. In 1905, the biggest battle to date would be the Battle of Mukden in the Russo-Japanese War. That would be a total of 550,000 soldiers, of whom 89,000 Russian and 76,000 Japanese would become casualties. The lists are appalling. And then get into World War I, the battles of Passchendaele, the battles of the Somme, and indeed World War II, Stalingrad, particularly the battles in the East. These figures are paltry compared to what would happen later on. But at the time, they were appalling. Long lists, people would congregate around general stores when it came out that Telegraph had brought in a list of casualties. And there are many paintings of the Civil War in both North and South of townspeople gathering around a public building where casualty lists from a previous battle are being posted. That became almost a expected scenario after battle. The Civil War would ultimately consume 620,000 lives, or is it 630, or is it more? Doris Drew Gilpin Faust's splendid book, This Republic of Suffering, which I trust some of you, maybe many of you have read, goes into the casualties in the most graphic and memorable fashion. 630,000. Almost 25% of the entire Confederate male population is killed or dies of disease. Of these 630,000 dead, more than half of them would die of disease. Something that will be repeated in subsequent wars up until the Franco-Prussian War, interestingly enough. But both sides are shocked, not only at the magnitude of the casualties, but the magnitude of the battle. Lincoln and Davis now realize that it's not going to be a quick war. One more battle is not going to do it. Both sides are going to fight with increasing desperation as the war proceeds, and casualties will continue to mount, and nobody can see how long this will last. General Scott, who by now is forced into retirement, was correct. Moreover, because of the increasing casualties, the possibility of a negotiated peace becomes less and less and less. And indeed, Davis says it in his first inaugural, that nothing short of independence for the Confederacy would be an acceptable term, period. Lincoln made it clear that nothing short of the Confederate States, the rebellious states, because Lincoln never recognized the existence of this thing called the Confederate States of America. These are rebellious states in rebellion against the lawful authority. Only when they come back into the Union can peace be restored. Well, these are two totally inimical objects. They cannot be reconciled. They cannot be compromised. The war would go on until one side is crushed, literally, its armies destroyed, its government in ruins. Then and only then will the war end. And it ends not by any kind of political surrender, but by the surrender of what armies remained standing. There was no more Confederacy. There were no more Confederate armies. Ergo, the war was over. But that's what it would take. And it would take 3 more years after Shiloh. Armies are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Battle is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Gettysburg is almost 100,000 men total, where the, well, it was 55 and 35, I believe. 55,000 Union, 35,000 Confederates. Chattanooga, Chickamauga, the only battle in the history of the Civil War where the Confederates outnumbered the Union forces, was almost as big. But there would be larger armies, there would be conscripted armies, and huge numbers of them would become casualties. The Union had the ability to replenish its forces. The Confederacy didn't. Factoid, during the Civil War, the United States of America, that is the Union, gained in population through the course of the war. That's even after losing 360 some odd thousand men. And how did that happen? Immigration. Immigration to the United States continued rapidly throughout the Civil War. Many immigrants, in fact, joined the Army. There was an Irish brigade in the Union Army and in the Confederate Army. Both armies had an Irish brigade. So the Irish people that came to this country were divided, as was indeed the rest of the country. Mass casualties, senior officers being killed or wounded out of action. Last slide. So, what about this fellow on the right? What about Albert Sidney Johnston? Jefferson Davis, who believed him to be the finest general on the continent, never ever got over his death. For years after Johnston's death, the mention of his name would cause Davis to burst into tears. All of his hopes were pinned on Albert Sidney Johnston. Was he really that great a general? Great question, because he's one of those people who were killed or died before they could show their true ability or lack thereof. Okay, Stonewall Jackson the same way. Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan in their memoirs, all 3 of them, discounted Johnston's talents as a general, saying in essence that he had never faced a competent Union general. Translated, he'd never faced either of them, which is true. He never did. But what about Sidney Johnston? He was able by bluff to keep the Union forces at bay for some time. His control of the battle, his handling of the battle is a matter of considerable controversy. Should he have been at the front or should he have been behind the lines directing things? Well, his forte was directing troops, literally riding at their head. He was good at that, and they'd follow him and they'd follow him anywhere. We don't know. Could he have been saved? No, he could not have been saved. We don't know. We do know about him, though. We know that although Shiloh left U.S. Grant under somewhat of a cloud because he hadn't entrenched his army, was caught by surprise, and he was caught by surprise. He was able to rally, he was able to reform the army, and he was able to basically drive the Confederates back from the field. He was relieved of command for a short while, but after a while Lincoln understood, quote, I can't spare this man, he fights, unquote, that he didn't have another Grant, and so Grant again was given increasingly major and major commands until he became the General-in-Chief of the Army in early 1864 and led the Army on to victory, himself on to the presidency, and so forth. So we know about Grant, and we know something about Robert E. Lee, too. We don't know about Sidney Johnson. And we don't know about Stonewall Jackson. And we don't know about the other Union general, W.H.L. Wallace, man of great talent. John Reynolds, killed at Gettysburg. We don't know about any of these guys. That is war. Subsequent wars, particularly the First World War, would have the generals way behind the lines. Generals were not subjected to the kind of casualties and risks that they would be in, that they were in earlier wars. One of the generals of the Civil War was Kentuckian named Simon Bolivar Buckner. He was one of the Confederate commanders at Fort Donelson, who surrendered. Buckner was later repatriated. Buckner went on to finish his career in the military, and he had a son, Simon Bolivar Buckner III. Also followed his career in the military, became a three-star general, and had the dubious distinction of being the highest-ranking United States Army officer killed in World War II. Simon Bolivar Buckner III was killed about 2 weeks before the fighting ended on Okinawa. Shiloh, bloody Shiloh, ever be remembered. Thank you. Pardon me?